Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron, and it is my privilege to host this show where we get to talk to folks from all over the world who are education thought leaders and innovators. We are going to hear inspiring stories from educators and EdTech founders and AI experts and others who are fearlessly innovating and delivering unique learning experiences. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started.
I actually go back to that idea constantly and thinking about the Enlightenment when thinking about AI. And so one of the things that was so interesting to me is that even during the Enlightenment, right, they didn't call it the Enlightenment, they called it all these different things, but there was a recognition that a huge shift was happening in how they understood the world.
A fascinating discussion with Jason Gulya. We talk about all things AI in education, even a little bit about a comparison of this period of time to the Enlightenment. Jason's not really an advocate for AI, but he has spent an enormous amount of time thinking and writing and talking about the practical implications of AI in education. Keep listening. Well, welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I am joined today with Jason Gulya. He is an English professor and chair of the Artificial Intelligence Council at Berkeley College in New York. He's also an AI consultant and keynote speaker, a prolific content creator and social media influencer. Jason is vocal about the use of AI in education. He's earned a significant following through his practical and balanced advice. He's both an advocate and a skeptic, and we love his honesty and down-to-earth spirit as an on-the-ground teacher on his perspective. Now, I do have to note, sadly, he is a New York Yankees fan. I'm trying to get past that, and we'll have a good conversation, I'm sure. Anyway, but go Red Sox. All right. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you so much. And I will say, go Yankees. It's just giving the other side of it. But thank you so much for inviting me, coming to talk to me. And it's a pleasure to actually meet you and get to talk to you.
Yeah, no, we've been, I guess, kind of following each other and, lots of stuff on LinkedIn for quite a while. So as I say, you are prolific. You're all over the place on LinkedIn. I see you every day there. Speaking of which, you actually posted something today. I threw in a last minute question from your post today. All right, but let's jump right in. You made a comment somewhere, I saw it, that ChatGPT basically changed your life. So tell me about that. How and why?
Yeah, so ChatGPT really got me to go through a whole perspective shift in a very real way. So, and I talk about this story a lot. I think it actually might still be in my LinkedIn profile. But when I first saw ChatGPT, I spent some time playing with it, probably for about 10, 15 minutes, and I was absolutely horrified. I was floored by it. I thought that I had seen the future of plagiarism and it was going to just ruin college. It was going to ruin schooling, that everyone was going to use this program to just create papers and get A's, because I was putting in pretty basic stuff and getting papers that, with no context and no sort of looking for AI, probably get like a B, right? They do a pretty good job in a college level course. And it disturbed me so much that I put it aside probably for close to 2 weeks. And I went back to it, right? I was kind of following it from a distance for a little bit. I went back to it after about 2 weeks. And I said to myself, I'm not going to think about it as a teacher. Right? I'm just going to take that hat off. I'm going to throw it off to the side for the moment. I'm just going to think about it as a student, right? As a learner. And I started to just play around and just say, say I wanted to learn this in a certain way. And I have a sense of how I learn and how just my mind works. How can I do that? And that's when it started to shift for me. And that's actually one of the big shifts that I think, if you're going into a room of, say, faculty members or anyone in education, I think that's the big shift that really helps a lot of us, right? In terms of really leaning into this technology, because if we take that learner perspective, I think it fundamentally changes how we see the technology, right? We still want to have that dose of skepticism. We still want to push back when we really see something we need to push back against. But being able to take that perspective, which is really just an empathy shift, right? And a perspective shift, made all the difference for me. And now I try to do it every day. I try to think like a student with this technology and think about, because that's what I do every day. I'm a teacher. So whenever I look at a new program and a new thing, something else happens, which literally happens every hour, seemingly, I automatically think about it as a teacher. And now I think I've gotten a little bit better. And this is sort of how it's changed me as a thinker. I've gotten a little better at just practicing it to then get that focus on the student, right? Get that focus on the learner, that it's not as much of a pull now. It doesn't take quite as much effort to kind of do that, but originally, like, it really did. Like, it took 2 weeks of like putting it aside. I no longer have to do that because I couldn't, right? You can't function that way if you have to put everything aside for 2 weeks. But that's been kind of the big trajectory for me. And in basically all of my sessions, I try to talk about that because I think that many educators are still there, and I don't fault them at all, right? I don't fault someone from looking at this technology and being horrified or being depressed, right? There are all these really good emotions. I don't want to lose those either. Some educators are just flat out excited, right? And think this is awesome, right? Some are there, some are on the horror side. A lot of people are in the middle, and I don't shame anyone, right? All of those emotions are like perfectly valid. So that's one of the reasons I try to talk about that experience. I kind of went from being very horrified to being like okay with it, but still having a dose of skepticism.
Yeah. So how did you kind of get past the plagiarism thing though? Because this is still, right, a major problem for a lot of teachers out there, right? They just see this as a mechanism to cheat, and and I'm sure there are kids who are using it to cheat, but how do we get past that kind of perspective, that attitude about it, and help the kids use it ethically, responsibly?
So one of the things I try to emphasize is that in many ways, if we really lean into this technology, we can actually just be better teachers. And one of the reasons I push that is because socially there's this focus on speed and ease, right? You go online, you look at people using ChatGPT or any AI program, and it's all about let's just churn these things out faster and faster and faster and faster. And one of the things that I learned very quickly once I started to talk to more educators is that falls flat. There's some interest in it, right? I think we all want to ease workload. We want to be able to say, if we have to create a lesson plan, something, if we don't like creating lesson plans, we can do it pretty quickly. But that to really get people to kind of approach this technology in a useful way, we need to talk about effectiveness too, right? That there are ways that I can use AI to do things I couldn't do. Like, I flat out could not do, even if I had a week dedicated to doing them. And now I'm doing them in 10 minutes. And I think that we need to have that as part of the conversation because there needs to be a holistic approach. And many of us, I totally get, we want to maintain academic integrity. We want to make sure that's there because if you're not doing your own work, you're not really learning, right? You don't learn from, for a lot of us don't anyway, from just creating a paper through ChatGPT or any AI program. But I try to be as holistic as possible. And the other point that I try to make constantly is that it's still early on, right? This technology for a lot of us has only been widely acceptable for 2 years, not even. And even now, it's so difficult to detect if something was AI written, right? AI detectors, they just do not work, right? And they certainly don't work well enough in high stakes situations. Because when you're talking about maintaining academic integrity, so if you're talking about accusing a student of cheating, right? We're talking about failing papers. We're talking about failing classes. We're talking about expulsion, right? Once we get into that kind of conversation, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Plagiarism accusations are automatically high stakes, right? Because they have been for a really, really long time. And so many institutions are just roping AI use into that. And that's really a recipe for disaster. And so for me, I try to be very practical. And I personally do not think what is happening at a lot of colleges right now with AI and academic integrity is sustainable. I don't think it is. And I kind of have learned to call this the AI professor's dilemma, right? So basically, at a lot of colleges, based off of my experience, faculty members, and I've seen this in high schools and middle schools as well, are basically being told two things. The first thing is that they can use AI detectors, right? And they can rely on them. So the professors are taking a student paper, they're running it through GPT-0, Zero GPT, Copy Leaks, whatever programs they're using. Maybe they're using all of them, and they're putting it in them, and they can rely on that information, right? So that's the first thing they're being told, which I do not think is true. But the second thing they're being told, and this is where it explodes, is that even though those are reliable, they're not good enough to hold up against pushback. So that if they approach a student and say, oh, your paper got a 100% score on Copy Leaks, you cheated, here's a 0, right? Because that's happening. But if a student comes in at most colleges and says, no, I didn't cheat, it's not going to hold up, right? It's going to be overturned. And that is a disaster, right? I don't think you can sustain that, because what ends up happening, regardless of if a student used it or not, right? In some ways, I think that's kind of irrelevant, but you can't sustain that kind of emotionally charged situation, because what ends up happening is the professor, and it happens all the time, a professor or a teacher goes up to a student, accuses them, or does it online, and they literally cross their fingers, right? And they hope, please don't question it, right? Please don't push back, because I know it's going to fall apart and there's nothing I can do about it. And our relationship is broken, right? I don't think you can come back from that, because, and I've talked to many students, and I do believe them, who said that they took a Composition 1 course, they were accused of cheating, and they didn't touch AI. And we know that's happening. And so for me, that is so tragic, because it means the breaking down of the teacher and student relationship. And sometimes that's contained, right? It's just as for that teacher or that professor. Sometimes it carries over. And that's when it becomes really, really awful, right? That student now doesn't trust their professors, or trust their teachers, or trust their college, right? Because for many students, if you have a bad interaction or relationship with the teacher, that reflects on the entire institution. Maybe they transfer. Maybe they leave college, right? Maybe they drop out, right? Yeah. All these kind of horrible, horrible things. And so I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about academic integrity. I understand why people focus on it, but I think we have to be very, very careful about how we approach it.
Yeah, I keep seeing a lot of this. I'm also quite active on Facebook in a group with, it's like 400,000 educators in one group. And, I have posted several times and said, you understand what you're doing is guilty until proven innocent, right? That you're going in with this assumption that you've used AI, and you have to prove to me now that you didn't. Right? And again, you talk about this just broken trust. And they're doing it everywhere. And I've noticed I'm not very popular on the group now when I say, "Oh, guilty until proven innocent" again, right? Because they do it every time. It's like, "Oh yeah, I'm sure they're cheating, so I'm going to make them handwrite it in class, right, on paper and pencil." Like, really? Well, let's go back to the 19th century.
Accessibility problems too.
Yeah.
And for me, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And I was going to say, for me, one of the tips or activities I give to anyone who wants to use those programs, and for me, this is the bare minimum, right? If you want to take student writing and pop it into an AI detector, before you do that, take 5 to 10 minutes, take your own writing. Doesn't matter when you wrote it. It can be you wrote it last week, you wrote it 10 years ago. Just take it, pop it into a couple of them, right? Just put your own writing in there, right? Put it in Copy Leaks, put it in GPT-0, whatever else you want. Put it in there, look at the score. And in many ways, the score is even irrelevant. You might get a high score, you might get a low score, but just think and reflect on the emotions that pop up when you do that, right? As for me, I did that. I got one score is like 80%. I wrote it 10 years ago. I had no access to ChatGPT or anything like that. And so, yeah, you'll get those having every once in a while, but also just like sitting back and you just feel, I felt kind of dirty. I felt violated, right? By just running it through these programs and having it scan my writing and match it up with AI programs and coming up with some sort of score. And that's writing that I really, really slaved over, right? That I really worked hard on and was emotional, because writing can be very emotional when you're caught up in it. And to have it go through a detector like that, it did a couple things for me. One, it just made me completely get rid of AI detectors. And it actually got me to move away from things like Turnitin completely, right? Because we've been doing that for years, and I've been doing it for years without question, right? You take a student's writing, you pop it in there, and it's obviously saving the information because that's how it works. It needs to have a database, a collection of papers to match things up against. But even that, like suddenly that felt different, right? Having papers go through Turnitin at all, or any program we're using, felt very different to me because I went through that experience. And again, like if you go through that, if you do that, I think that's a bare minimum, right? Because we are not giving students a chance to opt in or opt out. We're just doing that without question. So do it to yourself, right? Like 5-10 minutes, see what that's like, because students know it's happening. Right? They absolutely know it's happening. They put it in there sometimes, depending on your LMS, they even see like the percentage score. They might see green, yellow, blue, whatever the colors are that they use. But for me, that's a bare minimum that we should walk the walk, right? If
Yeah.
we are doing that to our students, we should do it to ourselves, because that's just an informed perspective.
All right. That's really, really good discussion. This is why I wanted you on, because you're so balanced in your perspective on stuff. So I'm curious though, I mean, I do a lot of, reading and, quite a bit of posting and stuff, but you're out there, every day, and somehow you come up with, clever, useful, thought-provoking posts. So how do you do that? How do you come up with so much stuff every day consistently?
I wish I had a system for you. So it's one of the things that's changed with me with social media is one of the reasons I never really liked it, that I just didn't get ignited by it, was that I always thought, and my students do this too, that to write something on social media or present anything in any way, it needed to be completely worked out, right? It needed to be a fully fledged thoughts before you went out and you wrote it on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. And one of the things that I've tried to lean into, and this has helped me, I think, just generate ideas, is to just say, I'm not going to do that. Right. So many people are already doing that. I'm going to take the approach to writing as really experimental, right? I'm thinking through this idea. So I posted something like yesterday or today on Substack about AI graders. And this might be what you're going to ask me about, because I just remember that's what I wrote about today. And I haven't made up my mind. I go back and forth. And so old me would have just said, I'm not going to write about it. I'm just going to push it off to the side. New me is just saying, I'm going to use the writing process. And it doesn't have to be writing. It can be making a video. It can be whatever kind of method of creation I just pick up that day. I'm going to use it to kind of figure things out. And I'm going to work out in public. And one of the reasons I did that is very practically, I graduated grad school, right? I used to have like forums for doing that, whether it was like a discussion in class or a mentor or someone on my dissertation committee. I was handing them something and having a discourse about it. And suddenly, graduating, becoming a professor, I didn't really have that, at least in a consistent way. And so that's what I try to do. And I do think that approach shows, because it just, everything I'm just trying to work through. And I'm also willing to be convinced that I'm wrong, right? That someone might come in and say, oh, but what about this? And I would say, actually, that's really interesting. I wonder if I'm wrong, right? Or if I need to rethink something or rethink an update, right? If it's an update to an AI program or something like that. Sometimes I'm wrong. I misunderstood something. I misapproached something. And so really just comes down to, and this isn't really a system or anything, just like thinking out loud, right? And being willing to kind of use writing or, creating a video or whatever it is to kind of just do that. And I think I've gotten a little bit better, especially over the last year, I think, of just being vulnerable. And part of that too is, with video, not feeling like it needs to be fully edited, right? That I've actually gotten, more interesting conversations and connections by just filming something from my cell phone, right? Like, oh, I have a thought, just like put it there. Nothing. I almost never script those, and I just put them on there. And I have some creators who are doing that and kind of, helped me see that, oh, actually, you can do that, and there's a value in that. But in the past, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, I'm still wrestling with it myself. I'm starting to put out some short videos and trying to get myself to not perfect them and practice them and,
It's
clean up
hard.
the video. It's hard.
Yeah.
It is really, really hard. I am a perfectionist. Are you familiar with Gary V? They call him.
I am. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So he's one of those who he just throws stuff out there. He puts no effort at all into editing or polishing. You get the real him every time. And yes, I was fascinated with his style. I just can't do it. Just
Yeah. It's
can't bring
it's really
myself to it.
hard. It's really hard to imitate. And in some ways I just kind of give up imitating, right? That
Yeah,
you can kind of do. And one of the things that has sort of helped for me, especially the last couple of months, is if you have any long form content, right? Video you created, this podcast, anything like that, using an AI program. There are tons of them now, Opus Clips, Vizor. There are so many more of them. Actually, I think Riverside has one native to its platform, but that, takes a piece of long form content and uses AI to chop it up, right? And that has actually really helped me because it allowed me to see like, oh, I can just like talk for an hour and it's chunkable, right? Because for me, what worried me was those chunks, right? If you're making a video and just say, I'm going to make a 1 minute long video, that's the barrier, right? The
Yeah.
barrier is never talk for an hour and turn it into something. The barrier was you have 1 minute on a camera, go, right? That's when my mind just couldn't get past it. So actually those AO programs helped me because it allowed me to see that you can talk for an hour and then sometimes, not always, you can use those programs to get something reasonable that you can then just send out there. And it's much more genuine that way because it's not like everything is fully scripted, fully worked out, anything like that.
Yeah. Cool. Great advice for content creators out there. All right. I'm not sure you're going to like this question. You're either going to like it or you're going to hate it. I don't know. So I'll just throw it out there and see what happens. Your PhD is in philosophy, and you researched allegory of enlightenment in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. So just to kind of, I'm going to attempt to brutally put that in layman's terms. So my perspective on that is you studied how the British used misdirection in literature to make a point without directly making the point. And feel free to fix that horrible, oversimplification. But I'm curious, how this your study affected your perception now on generative AI in the present.
Yeah, I actually love that question because originally I did not see a connection at all. But yeah, my PhD, and I actually have a book too on 17th and 18th century British allegory, which, as you mentioned, is all about writing a story that has encoded in it the fact that it's about something else. Right. So it's all about, so it's called, speaking otherwise is kind of the quick shorthand to it. It's understood, and there are certain signals usually in the text that you read something and you're not meant to take it literally. You're meant to take it as about something else, whether it's religious or political, right? You have all these stories during the period. You read a story and it's actually supposed to be political figures at the time. And it's often making fun of that, right? And kind of critiquing them in very real and sharp ways. And the way that my research ended up going was trying to figure out what happened to that genre, because the idea was for many scholars that once the Enlightenment hits, right, which is really kind of the foundation for many of us of the scientific revolution, right, in the US as in the UK around the same time. There might be a little bit of discrepancy of like 10 years, but it's around the same time because there's so much conversation across the Atlantic going on. And so the idea was that when the Enlightenment happened, allegory dies. Like that's kind of the conventional story we were all told. But one of the things that I found out in my research was that that was fundamentally not true, right? That people rethought it, they revamped it, they had different ways that they worked it into other forms of writing. And I actually go back to that idea constantly and thinking about the Enlightenment when thinking about AI. And so one of the things that was so interesting to me is that even during the Enlightenment, right? They didn't call it the Enlightenment. They called it all these different things. But there was a recognition that a huge shift was happening in how they understood the world. That former models that used to work no longer do. So one of the big examples is germ theory. In 1700, no one knew about germs. They didn't know it existed. Right? People were getting sick, right? They actually were drinking the water that used to have feces in it, and that was killing them, right? In thousands and thousands, right? And so by the time they get to 1780, they understand there are these tiny little microbes, these little germs that actually can be very, very dangerous. That one of the big technologies that got really, really important during the Enlightenment was the microscope, right? Which kind of opened up. So, and it's actually sort of cool now thinking about it, but they kind of understood this in the same way that you think about a telescope. So you look through a telescope and you recognize there's all that you can keep going and going and going and going and going and going, and it never ever stops, right? It's this ever expanding universe. And during the period, they approached the microscopes that way. Right. In some ways, we still do. You could keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, like opened up these universes that were just tinier and tinier. And so there's this recognition during the period that there was this huge shift, and many people were just trying to deal with it. And so for me, the parallels with what's going on with AI and generative AI are huge. That I actually think that there's a lot of continuity there. That, as with every historical period, we like to think we're special. We like to think that this is, the game changer. This is the big shift. This is the biggest thing to ever happen to humans. It's bigger than the internet. It's bigger than fire. It's bigger, and we see those arguments everywhere. But I do think we need to take a step back, because I think that in many ways, we're literally dealing with the seeds of, or sorry, the seeds that were put there by the Enlightenment, and now they're starting to blossom, right? I'm kind of lean into that analogy that this is not new, right? There are models for thinking about robots and for thinking about automatons in the Enlightenment period. They were fascinated by it, right? And that fascination has very much gone to the present day, because that question of creation was huge for them, right? Because for them, thinking about robots, a lot of times it was about the created, but they thought a lot about the creator, right? What happens when they start making stuff, right? When they start building things, and those things are getting, transcending the human capabilities. That's actually in Frankenstein too, right? That novel is fundamentally about creating something that is stronger, faster, and better than humans, right? So it's like hard not to see comparisons there. And even there, right, there's a question of what happens when we create things. That's why Bride of Frankenstein comes out, right? That's why that's a thing, right? What happens when they can then create life, and what so for me, there's a lot of comparisons, and I go back to it constantly because we're dealing with a huge shift, I think, or at least this perception of a shift, but there are analogous periods to look at. And for me, the Enlightenment is one of them.
Yeah. Very interesting. Oh, I'm glad I asked that question, because I really wasn't sure what you were going to do with that, but it does actually
That was a
make
very
a
long-winded
lot of
answer.
sense. Well, no, and I get it. Actually, in my career in 30 years in, IT, and watching technology progress, for me, this is just kind of another clear step that we kind of always knew it was going to be there, that at some point machines were going to be super intelligent. And I think it's accelerating faster than we probably were able to wrap our heads around a few years ago, the pace of technology change. But the fact that it's changing doesn't shock me. It seemed kind of inevitable for at least my view of the world. All
Yeah,
right.
and the anxiety about containment, which is everywhere, right? So even reading something like The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleiman and just thinking about his model for containment and the anxiety that's built into containment, that's not new, right? That is built into how we see the world, the way our own methods of seeing and thinking are very much continuous with what was happening in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? We haven't escaped that history yet. It very much shapes our own perspective. And so when we look at something like AI, we actually see those ideas and those anxieties, which are embedded in how we see the world, we see them popping up, and they're not new.
Yeah, yeah. Well, another, thought that occurs to me there too is it's kind of the genie's out of the bottle, right? And in fact, there was a post today too that commented on, I think you posted something about kids saying when they don't use AI, some of them saying, "Oh, I'm not a techie," right? And for me, right, so again, I wasn't surprised by generative AI. For me, I was just like, oh my God, this is just the coolest thing, right? I've been watching AI progress for years, and then all of a sudden it pops on the scene. But for most of the population, right, this was, they didn't see this coming, right? They're just so surprised that, computers can do this. And so I say, it's like, the genie's out now and everybody can see him, right? He's not secret anymore. There are, really, really not intelligent the way we think of human intelligence, but very smart, capable machines now that can do things we never thought they could do. So anyway, I want to come back to kind of teachers and perception that's out there. So you've been doing quite a bit of PD, working with teachers, trying to help them through this transition and figure out what to do. How much are you seeing now in a kind of a shift in attitudes? Because I know there was a lot of fear and like your reaction, this is, the future of, plagiarism was your first, gut instinct. And then, you had to kind of learn to, you know, how do we work with this thing, right? So what are you seeing in teachers in general? Is it improving or attitudes changing?
I think they are changing, but slower than I would like. I would like to kind of nudge them along a little bit more. And actually, the progression hasn't taken the form that I thought it was going to take. So, originally, as you mentioned, there was so much fear, so many people, even today. Right, I go into a group of faculty members, administrators, and then many of them have not really used ChatGPT or any standalone AI program like that. Or maybe they use it once or twice, basically said the output isn't great. They moved on. They didn't think about prompting. They didn't say, "Oh, well, maybe I'm just not giving it what it needs to have." So many faculty members and people in especially higher education haven't gotten to that point yet. But I do think one of the big things that's changing is I am seeing the needle move with AI detectors. Now, talking to faculty, say 6 months ago, I would go into a room and there were basically two main perspectives, right? There was almost, and I was usually the naysayer in the group, this idea that AI should just be pushed out of the college classroom, right? That was kind of the standard, especially like a year ago. Most faculty were there. I don't think that's the same. And I think that now, back then, there were these two lines of thought. One was that we could use AI detectors, right, and rely on them. And another was, and this was said all the time, I've been teaching for X number of years. I know if something was AI generated, right? I know, I can feel it, right? I feel like you know it when you see it, right? You don't need an AI detector. You can just read that essay and you can just feel the fact that a robot wrote it. And then I think we're seeing those approaches kind of explode as this technology advances and as more and more people recognize, and I think this is starting to happen with faculty, that you can do so much with AI that if you wanted to train it to write like you can train it to write like you. And it's getting easier and easier to do that. And now we're starting to see with platforms, and I suspect this is going to happen with something like ChatGPT now that it has memory across threads and things like that. It might be really simple, right? It might just be write like me and not need any prompting because it has all the chats and it knows how you write. You might actually not need to feed it like documents. You might just see, write like me and it'll be able to do it. And I think that is becoming a growing recognition that now if I go into a group of faculty members, I am seeing much more skepticism about using AI detectors. It used to be that everyone was using them, everyone relied on them. Now I might go into a group of 30 educators and 20 of them might go in and saying, yo, you really cannot use those. Right. And that would not be like an anomaly. So I think that has happened. I think that now there's this growing skepticism of just like the gut test, right? You'll know it when you see it. I don't think many faculty members feel that way anymore. I think that's happening. So I think we're starting to see, at least in a broader way, the move towards skepticism. I think that needle is moving based off of what I've seen and who I've interacted with. I think for a lot of them, they haven't gotten into the embracing part, right? And maybe some of them never will, and that's okay. And they can make that decision. But, think for many of them, that means that they're interested in using AI, but they just don't know how. Yeah. And that's okay. I'm okay with that question, right? If I'm talking to someone and they're like, oh, you know what? I think I can use AI to do blank, right? To improve my students' education. And I just need some coaching to know how, right? How can you do that? What can that look like? Because that's, I think, where now a lot of faculty members are. And that for me is super coachable, right? That is something like I can work with that. That's what's that? Yeah, exactly. That's what I hope for. Like I could do that, right? If you've gone through that mental shift and you're at the point of just thinking about how and just needing models and needing someone to throw ideas at and just thinking, oh, maybe I can create a scenario for my students to practice X, whatever the skill is. If you're there, like you're ahead of the game. All right. You're ahead of the game, not just in terms of educators, but in terms of society, right? One of the things that if we get outside of our AI bubble and we talk to many people, many, many people have not used this technology yet. Maybe even heard of it. And they're not there yet. And so for any educator who is there, they're ahead of the educational and the social curves. And I try to emphasize that because so many faculty members think that they're behind and they're just not, right? Like if they come in and say, all right, I want to use it. I want to revamp something so that, it has AI embedded in it. And this is what I'm not quite sure what it looks like. Yeah, you're like three steps ahead, right? Yeah. But they still feel like they're behind.
Yeah. Well, and I noticed that, one of the major kind of malfunctions initially, so many people, they're used to Googling, right? They know what a search engine is. Yeah. And so they try to use ChatGPT like they would Google, right? They just put a one-line question in there and sit back and go, all right, give me the answer, right? And you're like, no, you're missing the whole concept here. It's a dialogue, right? You're going to have with it, right? It's a language model. But yeah, that takes some playing and some getting used to it. But, I've seen enough of those stories too, where a teacher, right, tried to use it like a search engine and got trapped back, hallucinations or whatever, and just said, oh, I'm done. Yeah, I don't see the purpose in this. you know. So I'm glad we're getting past that. It's good that even slowly, yes, changes in education come painfully slow in my experience.
And a lot of my students approach it that way too. They go and they have a dialogue with ChatGPT and they're just using it to retrieve answers in the way that they would from the search engine. And it's AI and it's all about, using predictions and algorithms. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And it's like, it's hard to get them to play with the technology if they're going in and asking it a basic factual question and getting the wrong answer, right? Yeah. Something like, what is the capital of blank? And they're just getting wrong things and they're using it that way. And it really does take some time. It really takes some time to use this technology before we see use cases. I think Ethan Malik has called it the 10-hour rule. It doesn't have to be 10 hours, but some amount of time when you play with this technology enough that you start to see use cases and you start to say, oh, this is actually how I can use it. But we need to get there. Right? Yeah. You need to get to that point because if you're playing with it for 20 minutes and saying, oh, it's not all it's hyped up to be, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but you need to kind of give it that additional time. And I think, at least for me, for a lot of us anyway, it does change how you approach it.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating that people still see it, I guess, because of that label AI, as it being, for techies. And to me, it's like, no, it's about language, right? I mean, that's really the key to it is, well, this is the other thing that just fascinates me. I've always been fascinated with questions and the importance of questions, right? So often it's not about who has the best answer, it's who has the best question, right? And these systems are really, like that. I mean, even in a search engine, right? You got to ask a good question to get a good answer. But in ChatGPT, how well you communicate with it absolutely dictates how useful it's going to be to you, right? So, and I think this is hopefully part of what we're starting to teach kids, right? Students, how to use this is that, yes, you have to be competent in your communication skills or you're not going to get anything useful out of AI either, right? Because it's playing off of you. Yeah, the better you communicate, the better it communicates back. So, anyway.
And that's one of the very weird divides that has happened in writing studies. It's very, very strange going into a room of English professors or anyone who anyone, it doesn't have to be English professors, anyone who really believes that writing is a way of thinking and a way of understanding the world. And when you go into those rooms, it's very, very strange because we have some people who will say writing is dead. And then some people will say writing is the go-to skill in English, and any focus on language is the go-to skill that's going to get you a job, and it's going to be huge, right? And it's like a weird divide. Very few people are in the middle. And it's like, all right, so you think our discipline is dead. You think our discipline is going to take off. And one of the things that's so tricky is I don't know where institutions are going to land because they could go either way, right? If you're a college, you can take either perspective. I could see a college going in, seeing AI and saying, all right, we're really going to kill our English program. We're going to kill our writing program. It's really just not a useful skill in the workforce going forward. I can see that happening. I could just as equally see colleges saying, all right, we really need to beef up our liberal arts. We need to beef up our writing. Everyone needs to know how to write and use these systems. And if they're just going and using basic writing, they're getting basic answers and they're not going to get a job. You go either way. And I imagine just because there are enough institutions, some will
Yeah.
go one way, some will go the other. And I don't know who's going to win, if anyone wins.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I think that writing essays will be a thing of the past, that folks are just going to have to come to grips with that reality that if you're assigning essays and trying to do assessment on essays, that this is really, really problematic now because you can't tell if the student wrote it or not. But
Yeah. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think that whenever you say that to someone who teaches writing,
yeah,
this nostalgia sets in. And it's very hard to push against that nostalgia. And I fall victim to it to myself. And I love writing, but I'll be honest, I didn't like writing papers as an undergraduate. I think that later as I went to grad school, I got some pleasure out of, but they didn't feel like papers anymore, right? They felt very, very different. And one of my hopes is that this is the push a lot of us need to come up with alternatives to things we already hated. I never really knew how many professors were teaching 5-paragraph essays until ChatGPT took off. I was like legitimately astounded because I never taught them. I never wrote them, right? I was taught to never teach a 5-paragraph essay, especially in college. And
mhm,
so for me, a 5-paragraph essay, which doesn't actually have to do with the number of paragraphs, it's just a form, right? Paragraph number 1, it announces the number of points, right? Usually 3, then 1 body paragraph for each point, conclusion, restating the whole thing, not saying anything new. So it's very, very circular, which ChatGPT nails those it nails them, right? Hits them out of the park. That is a very, AI can do that way better than I can. Like, it's not even close, right? I think I'm a better writer than ChatGPT, at least out of the box as it is today, but it will beat me 10 times out of 10 on that form of writing because it is mechanical, it is repetitious, it is, all the things we don't want in writing. And so when I started going to training and started to talk to people about AI, I was astounded by how many people were still teaching it. I
Yeah.
thought it had died, right? I didn't think anyone was really teaching it. And then it's like suddenly like, oh, but I really want a 5-paragraph essay about blank, whatever the topic is. And like my emotional response is always, really?
Yeah.
Did you? Like, were you really invested in that? You know, I even when I was talking to students years ago, I would ask them, you know, in sort of a cheeky way, especially as a grad student, you know, what's the best 5-paragraph essay you ever read out in the wild, right? Not in the class, but like out there in the world. None, because no one publishes them,
No one
right?
writes like
You
that.
don't, you won't
Yeah.
find them
Yeah.
out in a journal, in a publication. So, you know, the fact that so many people were teaching them and really like felt nostalgic when that was taken away from them really astounded me. I was not expecting that. And also just the focus on grammar, the number of faculty members who go through a paper and whether it was electronically or just on paper, were marking up grammar in red pen and saying, you know, you had 10 grammatical errors, 80%, right? And like that was it, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that still existed. Like I legitimately didn't know people were still doing that until this technology comes out and you start talking about it and they say, "Oh, but how am I going to count all the grammatical errors and take off?" Like, just don't do
You're right.
that.
Exactly. You're missing the whole point. So, well,
Yeah.
you might find this example interesting. So, I kind of stumbled upon this. I had a friend who put together a Dungeons and Dragons style game using generative AI. And he just shared this link with me because he knows I love games and stuff. And so I went in and played this thing. And Jason, it was absolutely fascinating. Immediately, I was just like, oh my God, it is so creative, right? So what it does is it plays Dungeon Master, if you're familiar with the game at all. And so it like co-authors this adventure with you. So it asks you, so, what do you want to be? And I don't know, I'll be a half breed elf or a ranger or whatever, right? I want to be a troll. You can tell it whatever you want, or you can ask it for advice, right? But then it crafts a story around what you want, and it embellishes all these details, and it creates characters for you to talk to and interact with, and it paints these scenes and describes the story, and it keeps stopping you and saying, so, what do you want to do? Do you want to go talk to the merchant? Do you want to go, set sail? What do you want to do? Right. And so you keep kind of saying, well, let's go on an adventure. Let's go, find a dragon or what, you tell it what you want to do, and it helps you craft the story. But it's really fun. I mean, really, really engaging. But it also occurred to me that almost immediately what I felt happen was my own creativity kind of released, right, or unleashed. That I it was kind of inspired by, it would start kind of down a path, and I go, oh yeah, but now we could go here and do this, and or I'd even kind of stop it and say, no, 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 wait, 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 I don't want to wrap this up yet. I want to do more of this. Let's
Right.
continue on this part of the adventure. And anyway, so I have actually shared it with some other folks who are doing creative writing with kids, saying, you might want to
Yeah.
try some of this because, it may get them to be more creative because it kind of helps them. It eats, it, um, anyway, it
Yeah,
feeds them.
can you share that with me?
Yeah, yeah,
I'd love to play with it. I think that that is one of the big use cases. And I've actually created educational games for my students, and it astounds me still to this day that I can do it this quickly and I can do it for free. Right. So one of the things that I've done with my students is if I had a reading, something that was challenging, and I just want a different way to do it, I could create a game with ChatGPT. I can have it code it. I can run that code through Replit for free, and I can just give them the code. I could literally turn it into a QR code, put it on a screen, and they can scan it with their phones and play it and
yeah,
do it. And I had ones where same sort of thing. You create an adventure one. Now, I don't know if you did yours like embedded in a chat bot. If you did that, you'll have much more, it'll be much more fun as opposed to what I was doing, which is very, very contained.
yeah,
It's not going to pivot quite as much. But being able to do that is huge.
yeah,
And there are all these examples where, people were going in saying, normally this would take me 4 hours. Now I can do it in an hour and things like that. And I remember, showing that to a group of faculty members. And I paused and I said, I was able to build this in 5 minutes. Without AI, it would have taken me 5 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
You never would have gotten
that's
it
the
done because you would have
extreme. Like,
changed your mind so many times. Yeah.
exactly. I would have to go to school. I would have to take another, or learn how to code. I'd have to go to like a boot camp. I'd have to learn how to code. I'd have to focus on Python. I'd have to, go through all these iterations. And even then, I still don't know if I could do it. And that's the thing where I see this sort of take off. Like, oh, you can do that and you can be creative with it. And especially now, if you can embed it in a chatbot, yeah, you can do Dungeons and Dragons, you can do fantasy, you can do, so say a student and you can give them different genres too.
Yeah.
Right. You can say, do a true crime, right? Or a mystery one, or whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
And just being
Exploring
able
the
to do
the
that.
moons of Jupiter. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And
Exactly.
that's an astounding use case to me,
Yeah.
because that is where we're thinking less about efficiency and just doing things fast and more about how can we be more effective, right? What can we do now that we couldn't do 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm psyched about that one. I'll send you the link. It's called Casual Legends is the name of it. All right.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out and play with it.
I did want to ask you about, so a quote from your post today. So I'm just going to read this. It says, we're going to see a lot of AI-enabled bad pedagogy before we see meaningful, more progressive change. So you want to elaborate on that? What do you mean by bad pedagogy?
All right, so this gets me in a little bit of trouble. So there's the good and the bad, and this is me trying to keep it balanced. So, and I won't even mention my LMS. But when you have an LMS, and a lot of them are doing the same sort of thing, and you see something like AI come into the scene very quickly and it's suddenly accessible to so many people, you'll see some people who are really thinking about creative uses, and then others who are thinking about how we can do the same things that no one really liked faster.
Yep.
Right? More standardized tests. How can I create more multiple choice exams more quickly, right? And you can go and you can find a ton of them, right? Instead of spending my time, looking at a reading and saying, here are 5 multiple choice questions, I can use an AI and I can create 10 of them or 20 of them in a fraction of the time. And that is not how I want to see this technology used. So that's a bad use. So we, especially in my field of writing and reading literature, which is all about ambiguity, right? It's all about leading into and kind of figuring out how these stories work. And then suddenly be able to, use AI because it's easier and just churn out multiple choice exams. Or another one I saw is student surveillance, right? There are so many different AI programs now for tracking students and seeing what they're doing and getting rid of any sort of time. I think they call it off stage time, when you're not being surveilled, you're not being just watched in the class. And now we have these programs that they're starting to peddle them that are scanning students' faces. Right. You walk into a room or you sit in a classroom and a program will scan your face. And now a lot of these are embedded in Zoom if you have a virtual class. And they will tell you if a student is confused or not. All kinds of problems with that, right? And so these programs where, now because we have more things enabled, right? We have more capabilities. We have LMSs, we have AI programs that are just focusing on bad teaching and bad learning. And the example I think, I shared today was in Texas. So one of the things that Texas is now doing is they have their STAR standardized tests. So these are state tests. And they're now cutting down. I think they're trying to save about $10 to $15 million. And how they're doing that is they're having AI graders do the first round. Now they do have humans in the loop built into it, although it's not quite clear how that's going to work, right? I don't think we have details because that's going to be where the devils are in the details, right? How that works is going to be so fundamentally important with how this technology is being used and whether it's ethical or unethical. And so that in many ways kind of it captures how I see a lot of administrations, a lot of colleges, and certainly school boards using this technology, right? How can we do what we're already doing, right? Standardized tests is kind of inhuman process. And how can we do it faster, right? I think I'm hoping that in a larger cultural way, we'll start to move past that. My hope with this technology is that it gets us to rethink what we're doing and why we're doing it. And the powers that be, I don't think are going to go quietly into the night, right? With something like standardized testing, that is a billion-dollar industry. So if there's a way that they can rope AI in, they're going to do that. And they're going to do that in a way that doesn't question the process. And I do see educators doing that too, right? Using forms of teaching and learning that just didn't work, right? How can I make PowerPoints faster? How can I make lectures faster? All right. Saves you time, doesn't really help the student at all. They're still sitting there for a lecture,
Yeah.
right? And things like that. So that's where I see a lot of people right now. And I'm hoping just with time, and I think this is part of how we do, and it's one of the things I wrote about over the last couple of days. Part of it has to do with just paradigm shifts, right? Paradigm shifts don't happen immediately. There's this whole process that people try to keep up appearances. They try to hold on to what they were already doing, and they don't want to let go. And then just through time and evidence and larger kind of cultural advancements, then they start to break apart. But paradigms do not die quietly. They do not go quietly into the night.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, and it's late here in Hong Kong, although it's finally
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
quieted
It's
down.
probably like 11 o'clock at night for you right
Yeah,
now, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah. There was a nasty thunderstorm here right before we started the call, but it does look better now, so that's good. So, anything else you wanted to talk about, to cover? Anything you wanted to say that I didn't give you the opportunity yet?
The only thing I'll say is just a call for anyone listening to talk to everyone you can. One of the things I really think is important is that, and I don't want this to sound too hokey, we're really going to have to work together. And this means, talking to people, not just who are gung ho AI enthusiasts, but people who are on the fence, people who are against this technology. There are very legitimate reasons to be against working this technology into schools. And I think that we need to have those conversations. And that's one of my pushes for conferences too. I would love to see if you have an AI conference, if they're willing to do it, right? Have people who are very, very skeptical about the use of AI. And I think that mix of perspectives, I think we need to have it because I think that, and this really worries me, we're starting to silo ourselves. We're starting to create our own bubbles. And it's going to make it so much harder to move forward and have any sort of real plan for dealing with technology. Because, I mean, in the US, we have an election coming up. And I'm terrified that we are not prepared at all for dealing with things like deepfakes. And we need to be ready for it, right? They're going to get more and more advanced, I suspect, as we go forward. And so we have a lot to deal with. We have a lot to approach. And if we allow ourselves to be in bubbles and to just talk about people who are all AI all the time or all anti-AI all the time, I think that's going to be so difficult. So for anyone listening, just talk to as many people as you can, get those different perspectives. I think that it's huge. And I think we're going to need it going forward, just socially.
Yeah. Awesome. I completely agree with you. We all need to keep our minds open to all of the perspectives here because yeah, it isn't black and white. It's not binary. There's good use cases and there's bad use cases. And it's changing so fast that anything you think you know right now about AI and its capabilities will change in the next, month probably. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And
keep
stakes
your
are
eye on it.
high. Like they
Yes.
really are. Stakes are high. That the technology we use changes the way we think.
Yeah.
It does. It's kind of just how we work as humans, right? Yes, it is just a tool, but tools also shape us.
Mm.
right? They become a part. That's part of what makes us human. They become a part of how we approach and understand the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad we finally got a chance to have this conversation. It's been delightful. And
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Jason. And hopefully we'll talk online soon.
All right. Sounds good, Eric.
All right. Thanks, man.
Bye.
Bye. Jason Gulya is a unique voice in a crowded and noisy space talking about AI and education. If you haven't already, followed him on LinkedIn and subscribed to his newsletter, you better get on that. Jason has a unique ability to empathize. I have such a hard time with that word, empathize with this student and really focus on their learning experience and their learning needs. And this really makes him a refreshing source of insight and how AI can be used in education. I also have to appreciate his concern that he raised about AI being used just to more efficiently deliver bad pedagogy. We need to be creative, and we need to look for ways that AI can be used to truly enhance education and learning. Okay, if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe and share. We've got lots of great guests lined up, incredible stories of innovation and education. You don't want to miss them. I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators Podcast. And for all those education innovators out there, thanks for doing what you do. You are making a difference.